In a quiet corner of the medieval countryside, far from kings and battles, there lived people whose stories were never written down. Tonight, we'll follow one of them, a simple man named Elric, a weaver who wakes before the sun and ends his day by the fire, threading silence into cloth. This is not a tale of war or glory. It is a slow walk through muddy roads, the soft creak of wooden looms, the scent of wet earth and warm bread. A life that meant everything to those who lived it, and perhaps something gentle for you now. If you're watching this because sleep won't come, let me know in the comments. Where are you from, and what time is it right now? I'm glad you're here. Don't forget to like and subscribe if these quiet stories help you rest. Now, close your eyes if you like, and let us begin. Elric always woke before the sun, always in the same bed, beneath the same patched blanket that held the scent of smoke, wool, and the faintest hint of dry mint. His room was still wrapped in darkness, but he didn't need light to know his surroundings. The wooden walls around him creaked in familiar patterns. The air was cold. The silence of morning still reigned, interrupted only by the occasional thump of a settling beam or the distant hoot of an owl returning home. He sat up slowly, careful not to let the old bed frame groan too loudly. His feet searched for the slippers made of leather scraps, worn thin from years of use. He stood, stretched, and walked to the hearth, where a dull orange glow whispered that yesterday's fire had not fully died. He knelt, added dry twigs and thin wood shavings, and blew gently. The flames responded like a patient animal being coaxed from sleep. The light flickered across the room, casting long shadows that danced across the rough plaster walls. He moved without hurry, without hesitation. His tunic was folded on the stool. His vest hung neatly on the hook by the door. The same motions every morning. The same pace. There was no rush. No bell. No employer waiting. Elric was his own timekeeper, his own master. His only schedule was the slow rhythm of thread and fiber. He filled the black kettle with cold water from the clay jug and set it over the fire. Then he sat by the hearth, wrapping his hands around a wooden cup. A pinch of dried mint leaves from a pouch, and soon the rising steam carried their clean scent into the air. He drank in silence, watching the fire, waiting for the world outside to change colors. When the sky finally shifted from black to a dull gray blue, he stepped outside. The village was still mostly asleep. The narrow dirt path outside his door was marked with the prints of chickens and cart wheels. Smoke lifted from only 2 or 3 chimneys. A dog barked from somewhere deep between the houses. Across the frost-covered fields, the shapes of grazing animals began to emerge through the fog. He stood for several minutes, just breathing. The air tasted of damp wood and cold soil. Behind him, the fire cracked and popped. The loom waited. Today he would work on linen. Clean, pale thread pulled tightly into neat rows, destined for the hands of a dyer who preferred blue. Elric didn't care what became of the cloth after he delivered it. He only cared that each thread lay flat, each pass of the shuttle tight and honest. He returned inside, hands now warm from the cup. The loom stood tall in the corner, half-dressed in the beginnings of fabric. He ran his fingers across the tensioned threads, checking for slack. Satisfied, he sat and placed his foot on the treadle. He exhaled. Then pressed. Wood clicked against wood. Thread slipped between finger and beam. The room filled with the sound of work, quiet, steady, patient. He didn't count hours. He didn't speak. Only the loom spoke, and it spoke in rhythm. Outside, the world woke slowly. A woman across the lane fetched water. A child cried, was hushed, then laughed. A horse snorted near the stable. But Elric heard none of it. His eyes were focused, his hands precise. This was his world. Cloth, thread, pattern. He moved like water around stones, finding the same calm path every day. At midday, he stopped to eat a small loaf of rye bread and a wedge of dry cheese. No words. No company. Just the creak of the stool, the sound of chewing, and the quiet satisfaction of hunger being answered. Then he returned to work, the loom waiting, obedient and still. As the day passed, light shifted across the room. The fire dimmed, then flared again with fresh wood. Shadows moved, stretching long across the floor. Elric worked until the threads ran out, until the shuttle could pass no more. Only then did he stop. He stood, stretched his back, and stepped outside once more. The sky was painted in soft orange. A few chickens scratched near the fence. Far off, the hills held the last of the sun. He didn't speak. There was no one to speak to. But he smiled, faintly. The cloth was done. The day was full. He returned inside, laid the finished roll on the table, covered it with linen, and swept the loose thread from the floor. He boiled more water, added another pinch of mint, and sat by the hearth. The fire danced again. The silence returned. Another day had passed, exactly as it should. The loom creaked like an old tree swaying in the wind. Elric's feet pressed down slowly on the treadles, lifting the heddles, allowing the shuttle to pass through the open shed. The motion was quiet, precise, and nearly soundless save for the occasional wooden clack. He had done this for so long that his hands barely needed thought. His muscles remembered the pattern. Today's cloth was for Jorund, the dyer in the next village. He was a tall, thin man who always wore gloves, even in summer, and spoke in a flat tone as if color bored him. But he paid honestly and always asked for blue linen, long and tight woven, ready to be dipped into his vats of indigo and woad. Elric didn't know what became of the cloth afterward. He never asked. Outside, the sun had risen fully, turning the fog into light mist. Through the small window near the loom, he could see the edge of the field where bare trees stood like sentinels. The frost was melting, dripping from the roof in slow, rhythmic drops that echoed faintly inside the house. As he worked, Elric counted not time, but passes. Each swing of the shuttle added another line to the cloth. Every dozen he checked the tension. Every 100 he adjusted the beam. It was his own rhythm, his own song. The world outside could spin as fast or slow as it liked, but inside his cottage, the pace was always his. By midday, the cloth had taken shape, long and straight, pale like river stone. The real blue would come later, but even now, Elric could see its ghost. He paused only once to stretch his legs and pour the rest of his mint tea into a bowl for the cat that sometimes visited. He hadn't seen it in days, but he still left the tea out, just in case. The fire needed feeding. He added a log and stirred the coals. Smoke curled lazily up the chimney. He sat again, placing his feet on the treadles, fingers on the beam, eyes on the thread. There was something comforting about it, the way each line of linen lay exactly where it should. No surprises. No confusion. Just form, structure, order. The day outside turned gold. Sunlight fell across the loom in slanted beams. Dust motes danced like tiny ghosts in the air. Elric didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but didn't show it. He kept weaving. His thoughts wandered gently. He remembered his father weaving at the same loom, years ago, his hands larger, his shoulders stronger. Elric had been small then, sitting on the floor, watching thread become cloth. He had thought it was magic. Maybe it still was. By late afternoon, he paused again, this time to eat. A boiled egg, a bit of pickled cabbage, and a crust of bread. He ate slowly, chewing without sound, staring at the cloth now stretched across the beam. He brushed away a loose fiber and nodded to himself. Good work. Steady. No knots. When he resumed, he worked faster. The light was fading. He didn't like weaving in full dark, even with firelight. The shadows made the threads harder to follow. His hands moved with purpose, his eyes scanning for imperfections. The shuttle passed back and forth, humming through its grooves. Outside, the village was winding down. Chickens clucked softly as they returned to their roosts. A boy shouted somewhere, then laughter. Doors closed. Smoke thickened in the sky. And still, Elric worked. The blue cloth grew, inch by inch, row by row. Just before nightfall, he stopped. His fingers ached faintly. The beam was full. The cloth was finished. He tied the final edge and unrolled the length, folding it carefully into thirds and laying it on the wooden table. He took a damp cloth and wiped the sweat from his brow, then poured what remained of the water into the kettle again. He sat near the fire, the day's labor beside him. Outside, the last light slipped below the hills. He didn't smile, but there was peace in his stillness. The cloth was ready. Tomorrow he would walk it to Jorund, hand it over without fanfare, accept his coin, and begin again. But tonight, he simply watched the fire, and let the silence weave around him. The morning after the cloth was finished, Elric rose at the same hour as always. The sky beyond his window was pale, touched with the faintest line of gold at the horizon. He dressed slowly, folding his worn tunic and vest with practiced hands, then slipped into his boots, which had softened over the years but still held their shape. The air outside was colder than the day before. A thin frost clung to the grass and the edges of his roof. He placed the folded cloth into a large canvas sack, tied it shut with twine, and slung it over one shoulder. The weight was familiar, not heavy but present, enough to remind him with every step that he had worked. The path to Joran's village took just over an hour by foot. It wound through the woods for half the journey, then opened to fields and meadows where sheep grazed behind low stone walls. Elric liked the walk. It asked nothing of him except presence. There were no choices to make, no conversations to hold. Just trees, air, and the rhythm of his boots on frozen soil. As he walked beneath bare branches, he noticed the stillness of the forest. A few birds stirred high above, hidden in the grey limbs. A rabbit darted across the trail, vanishing into a thicket of brown bramble. The trees creaked occasionally, answering the cold with quiet complaint. But mostly, there was silence. Not emptiness, just quiet life, unspoken. He stopped once at a stream, the water thin and slow. He knelt to splash some on his face, letting the cold shock settle into his skin. The cloth remained dry in the sack, carefully folded. He adjusted the twine, stood, and continued. By the time he reached the first field, the light had shifted. The sun now hovered behind clouds, casting a soft glow over the frosted grass. Smoke rose in small threads from the thatched houses of the distant village. Elric followed the path down a slight slope, boots pressing firm into the earth. A child on a fence waved to him. Elric raised one hand in return, offering the faintest smile. He recognized the boy, though he did not know his name. Perhaps he had seen him during a market day, or outside the tavern. The boy watched him pass, then returned to his task, carving something into a bit of bark with a dull knife. At the edge of the village stood Joran's workshop. The building was low and wide, with stained walls and barrels stacked beneath an awning. Elric stepped inside without knocking. He always did. Joran was already at work, stirring a large vat with a thick wooden pole. The smell was strong, sharp and earthy, the scent of wet leaves and old dye. "You're early," Joran said, not turning. "I finished early," Elric replied. He placed the sack on the table and opened it carefully. The cloth unrolled slowly, revealing its pale, clean surface. Joran glanced over, wiped his hands on his apron, and nodded. "Tight. Smooth. You didn't rush it." "I never do." Joran measured it with a long strip of knotted cord, muttering numbers under his breath. Then he opened a drawer and took out a small pouch. Coins clinked inside. Elric accepted the pouch without counting. He never did. Joran paid fair. "Will you want another order next week?" "Probably. Come by on Monday." Elric nodded once. Then turned. Outside, the sky had grown brighter, but the wind had picked up. He wrapped his scarf tighter and began the walk home. He didn't hurry. There was no reason to. Along the road, he passed the same trees, the same stone walls, the same wandering sheep. But they looked slightly different in the changing light. The shadows shorter. The color of frost giving way to thaw. He stopped once more at the stream. This time, he only looked. The water moved slowly, cutting through the land like a thought. He stood in silence, then continued walking, each step familiar, the weight of the coin pouch pressing gently against his side. Back in his cottage, the hearth had gone cold. He knelt to relight it. The room slowly filled with warmth again. He didn't unpack the coin. He didn't count his steps. He simply sat by the fire, letting the day settle into his bones. Tomorrow, he would begin a new role. Not because he had to, but because he always did. The village market came once each week, on the fourth morning after the full moon. It was the only day Elric left his loom behind for something other than delivery. He didn't much like crowds, but he understood the need for eggs, for salt, for thread he couldn't spin himself. And besides, there was a rhythm to market day too, noisy, yes, but familiar. He rose just as the sun breached the hills, a pale gold washing over the edge of the cottage. His hands were still sore from the last roll of linen, but the ache was a good one. It meant the cloth had been done well. He placed a small satchel of coins into his belt pouch, slipped on his boots, and covered his shoulders with a thick wool cloak. The morning was colder than usual. Clouds hung low, and the scent of wood smoke clung to the air like damp wool. He stepped outside and began the walk into the village square. By the time he arrived, the square was already half full. Carts stood at angles, wheels dusted with frost. Barrels of apples, bundles of dried herbs, loaves of black bread, and baskets of eggs lined the paths. People greeted each other with quiet nods or loud laughter, depending on temperament. Children darted between stalls with sticky fingers and mud on their boots. Elric moved slowly, not because he was old, but because he didn't like to rush. He checked the bread stall first. The woman there, Marta, greeted him with a grunt and slid 2 loaves toward him without speaking. He paid without asking the price. It was always the same. She gave him the slightly burnt one. She always did. He didn't mind. Next, he found a small packet of salt, tightly bound in waxed cloth. Then a spool of fine thread, dark gray, strong enough to hold linen firm. He touched it between 2 fingers, nodding slightly, and placed it in his pouch. At the far end of the square, a tinker had set up near the well. His wares were few: tin cups, a kettle with a dent, a basket of knives in need of sharpening. Elric didn't stop. He rarely needed anything the tinker had, though he liked the clatter the man made as he rearranged things. A boy was playing flute near the well. Not well, but with heart. The tune wavered but held a gentle rhythm. People dropped coins into his hat, and Elric added one without slowing. He remembered playing like that once, when his father's loom had sat quiet for weeks after an injury. The sound of a boy's flute in a cold square always pulled at something in him. He passed the meat stall, the cheese table, the row of dying winter pears. He didn't stop again until he reached the far edge of the square, where a woman sat alone with a single basket of dyed wool. Blues, reds, and a shade of pale green that caught the light like river glass. Elric stood quietly for a while. The woman looked up once, then back to her hands. She was spinning slowly, her foot working the pedal of a small wheel. The wool twisted evenly. "How much for the green?" he asked finally. She held up 2 fingers. He nodded and placed the coins into her palm. She wrapped the skein neatly in cloth and passed it to him without a word. He didn't need more wool, not really, but the color had reminded him of something he couldn't quite name, maybe a memory, or just the stream outside the village after rain. By the time he turned to leave, the square was louder. Voices led over voices, dogs barked, chickens protested their cages. The sun had fully risen, though the light remained gray and filtered. A horse refused to move beside the grain stall, kicking once before a hand calmed it. A baby cried, then hiccuped, then went silent. Elric made his way through the crowd without speaking. He nodded to a man selling spoons, tipped his head to a woman leading a blind sheep, and stepped wide around a puddle where 2 boys were splashing one another with grim delight. At the edge of the square, just before the path bent back toward the forest, he looked back once. Not because he had forgotten anything, but simply to see the market as it was, messy, loud, necessary. The path home felt longer with his bag heavier, though it didn't burden him. As he walked through the trees, the sounds of the market softened until they vanished. He breathed in slowly, letting the quiet return. At home, he unpacked the bread, the salt, the thread, and the green wool. He placed them where they belonged, each item finding its spot like it had waited for him. Then he sat by the fire again, broke a loaf in half, and ate in silence. The market had passed. The loom would call again tomorrow. It was nearly midday when the knock came. Elric had just finished rethreading the loom for the next roll, this one meant for a cooper who wrapped barrels in soft linen before sealing them for shipment. He was about to begin the first pass when the sound echoed through the cottage. 3 knocks, slow and even. He stood, wiped his hands on his tunic, and opened the door. On the threshold stood Bram, wrapped in a green cloak too thin for the season, his cheeks red from the cold, and his hands buried deep in his sleeves. Bram was younger than Elric by a few years, but louder in voice and looser in habit. "Still alive, I see," Bram said, pushing past without waiting for an invitation. "I brought beer. Figured you wouldn't have any." Elric shut the door and followed him inside. Bram had already settled by the hearth, setting down a clay jug and stretching out his legs. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks upward like tiny stars. Elric didn't say anything at first. He took down 2 cups from the shelf, poured the beer, and handed one to Bram without ceremony. They drank in silence for a while. The beer was dark and thick, with a bitter bite. It warmed the throat. Outside, the wind scratched at the walls like a dull knife, but inside, it was quiet. "I passed Marta," Bram said at last. "She said you bought burnt bread again." "It was the top one," Elric replied. "You could ask for better." "She saves it for me." Bram grinned. "You're hopeless." They drank again. Elric let the warmth settle into his bones, the silence stretched comfortably between them. Bram was one of the few people who could sit without needing to fill the air with sound. Most tried. Most failed. "I came because I heard about your father's loom," Bram said eventually, nodding toward it. "Still works. Still speaks. You ever think of changing it out? New wood? New frame?" "No," Elric said. Bram looked at the beam, the thread half-woven, the pedal worn smooth by years of feet. He said nothing more. Instead, he stood and walked to the shelf, scanning the bundles of yarn and boxes of spare heddles. "You keep everything where it always was. You're a relic. It all still works." "Fair enough," Bram said, returning to his cup. The afternoon passed slowly. They shared bread and a wedge of sharp cheese. Bram told a story about a peddler who'd sold boots that melted in the rain. Elric chuckled once, an actual chuckle, rare and dry. Then silence returned. The fire burned low. "Do you miss it?" Bram asked suddenly. "What?" "The noise. Town. Voices." Elric shook his head. "I miss music, sometimes. Not voices." Bram nodded. "I brought you something." He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the table. "Found it at the last fair. Thought you'd hate it. Then I thought maybe you'd use it." Elric unwrapped the cloth slowly. Inside was a wooden whistle, carved with spirals and birds. It was worn, clearly used, but still whole. He turned it in his hands. "You don't have to play it," Bram said quickly. "Just thought you should have it." Elric looked at it for a long time. "Thank you." They didn't speak after that. The wind outside had stilled. The fire gave off a steady glow. Elric placed the whistle on the mantel above the hearth and poured them each a final cup. When Bram left, the sun had dipped behind the trees. He pulled his cloak tighter, waved once, and disappeared down the path. Elric stood at the door for a moment, letting the cold air wrap around his ankles. Then he shut it, returned to the loom, and Saturday. His foot found the treadle. The shuttle waited. He began weaving again. The day began with wind. Not the soft kind that stirred leaves or gently nudged the chimney smoke, but a deep, pulsing wind that rolled in from the west and rattled the shutters before dawn. Elric noticed it the moment he woke. His blanket had shifted, and cold air slipped through the gaps in the wooden wall like fingers seeking warmth. He rose slowly, watching the fire reduce to soft ash. The usual quiet of morning was broken by the sound of the wind pushing against the roof, creaking the beams above his head. He lit the fire again, not out of routine, but out of need. The cold had settled deep in the stones. Outside, the sky was strange. Greenish-gray, layered in thick, uneven clouds that moved like waves. There was no rain yet, but the air felt heavy, dense in the chest, like breathing through soaked cloth. Elric did not begin work immediately. Something in the day told him to wait. He made tea, strong and bitter with crushed roots, then wrapped himself in his heavier cloak and stepped outside. The village was quiet, but not still. Doors opened and closed quickly. Chickens huddled against fence posts. A boy ran past holding firewood to his chest, eyes wide. At the edge of the fields, Elric stood beneath the bare branches and looked toward the western hills. The storm hadn't reached them yet, but it was coming. He could smell it, soil, wet and metallic, the scent of earth before breaking. He returned inside and removed the finished cloth from the loom. It was smaller than most, just a wrap for someone's child, or perhaps a lining for a trunk. He folded it carefully and placed it in the chest beneath the shelf. No sense letting it hang in a storm. By mid-morning, the wind had doubled. Trees bowed and groaned, the thatch on his roof fluttered at the edges. He checked the shutters, barred the door, and added more wood to the fire. The flames responded hungrily. He sat by the window for a while, watching the first drops of rain hit the ground like pebbles. Slow at first. Then faster. Then solid. Rain came sideways, thick and unrelenting. The cottage moaned around him. A loose shutter banged once, twice, before the latch held. The world outside blurred. The fields vanished. The forest became a smear of black trunks and thrashing limbs. The air hummed with pressure. Thunder growled, not in sharp cracks, but in long rolling bursts that passed like distant carts over stone bridges. Elric stayed seated, his hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on nothing. He did not fear storms. He had grown up with them. But this one felt old, like something remembered rather than new. He thought of his mother, lighting candles during dark skies, singing low songs in a tongue Elric never learned. He thought of his father securing the shutters with thick rope, nodding silently as the sky turned black. Hours passed. He didn't move much. At one point, he poured water into the kettle, not to drink, but simply to do something with his hands. The whistle Bram had given him sat on the mantel. He picked it up once, turned it over, then set it back down. By afternoon, the storm was at its peak. The light turned coppery, as if the world had been dipped in rust. Water ran in small rivers beneath the door, and the wind howled in high-pitched bursts, like someone screaming behind the hills. He rose only once, to check the thatch from the inside, feeling along the beams for leaks. None yet. But he placed a bucket beneath the weakest point, just in case. The fire was holding. That was enough. Eventually, the thunder softened. The rain thinned. The wind lost its shape. By evening, it had become only noise, a background whisper, like waves against a distant shore. Elric stepped outside again, just before the last light. The village was changed. Mud covered the paths. A tree had fallen across the fence near Marta's home. Smoke rose again from a few chimneys, thin and cautious. Chickens wandered through puddles. A cart had tipped, spilling firewood into the lane. He didn't speak to anyone. He walked the path once, checked the small stream where it had risen over its edge, then returned home. His boots were soaked, his hands red with cold. He stripped them off by the fire and wrapped himself in a dry cloth. The storm had passed. But its shape lingered, pressed into the corners of the village like a memory. He didn't touch the loom that evening. Instead, he sat with the whistle again, this time bringing it to his lips, not to play, but to feel the shape of it. The wood was smooth, the carvings soft beneath his fingers. He set it down again, leaned back in his chair, and listened to the quiet that followed. 2 days after the storm, the village was still drying. Mud lay thick along the paths, sucking at boots with every step. Fences leaned at odd angles. Laundry hung limp and cold on lines that had survived the wind. But the sky had turned clear, a bright blue that stretched far and made the frost glitter like glass. Elric was outside, repairing the frame of his woodpile. Some of the support beams had shifted during the storm, and the logs now sat unevenly. He didn't hurry. He placed one beam, stepped back, eyed the angle, adjusted, and hammered it in with slow, deliberate taps. As he worked, he heard something from the path, a light tread, quick and clumsy. He turned and saw a boy, thin, pale, with a cloak too big for him and a small dog trailing behind. The dog was all ribs and mud, its fur hanging in wet clumps. The boy stopped a few paces away and pushed his hair from his eyes. He didn't speak at first. "Are you the man who makes cloth?" the boy asked finally. Elric nodded. "I am." The boy looked down. "I need some." Elric set down the mallet. "Not for sale today." "It's not for selling," the boy said quickly. "It's for him." He glanced at the dog. The animal stood trembling, one paw lifted slightly off the ground. Elric studied the two of them. The boy couldn't have been more than 10. His boots were mismatched. His cloak was patched with old sackcloth. The dog looked worse. "I don't give thread to beggars," Elric said evenly. "I'm not begging." Elric raised an eyebrow. The boy reached into his cloak and pulled out a single silver coin. It was scuffed and warm from his hand. He held it up silently. Elric didn't take it. "What do you want?" he asked. "A blanket. Just big enough for him to sleep in. He shakes at night." Elric looked at the dog again. It wagged its tail once, as if understanding it was being spoken for. He stepped back inside without a word. A minute later, he returned with a narrow length of wool, soft and faded brown. "It's old," Elric said. "But clean." The boy took it like something holy. He dropped the coin into Elric's hand and wrapped the dog carefully. The animal didn't struggle. It curled in the fabric immediately, settling with a sigh. The boy sat down beside it in the dirt. "What's its name?" Elric asked. "Doesn't have one," the boy said. "I just call him Dog." Elric nodded. They sat in silence for a while. Elric picked up his mallet and resumed tapping the beam into place. The boy watched without speaking. Finally, the boy said, "Do you always live alone?" Elric didn't answer right away. "Mostly." "Why?" He shrugged. "Don't like noise." "I like quiet too," the boy said. "People are loud." Elric didn't disagree. "Do you eat bread?" the boy asked after a pause. "Yes. My aunt bakes. Sometimes. She says I eat like a mouse. That I should be fat by now." The boy scratched the dog behind the ears. The dog leaned into his hand. Elric finished the beam and set the mallet down. He stood and stretched his back, then walked to the small bench near the wall and sat down. The sun had climbed higher, and the wind was dry and cold. "Where do you live?" he asked. "Near the mill," the boy said. "But not in it. The shed beside it." "With your aunt?" The boy nodded. "She's mostly asleep." Elric watched the boy tuck the blanket closer around the dog. "You can stay there till it warms," he said. The boy nodded, but didn't move. The dog was already asleep. A little while later, Elric stepped inside and brought out half a loaf of bread. He broke it in two and offered one piece to the boy. "Thanks," the boy said. "Can Dog have some?" "Not too much." They ate in silence. The dog snored softly. When the bread was gone, the boy stood. "I'll bring the blanket back," he said. "No need." "I want to." Elric looked at him. "All right." The boy lifted the dog gently. It didn't wake. He nodded once to Elric, then turned and walked back down the path, his steps lighter than when he had arrived. Elric watched until they disappeared past the fence. He returned to the woodpile and finished bracing the last beam. When it was done, he sat again on the bench, warming his hands in the sun. The house was quiet. The path was quiet. Inside, the loom waited, the threads in place. But Elric didn't weave that afternoon. The morning came quiet. Not just silent, but quiet in the way still water is quiet, holding everything without saying anything. There was no wind, no footsteps outside, no bird on the roof. Even the fire seemed to burn without noise, its flames curling lazily around the logs. Elric woke before the sun as always. His body followed the same rhythm it had for years. But today, something in him hesitated. He lay still longer than usual, watching the beams above his head. They looked the same. But time had folded itself differently over the last few days, and he felt the weight of it now. He rose, dressed, and brewed tea, but he didn't drink it. Instead, he walked to the loom and stood before it, watching the threads rest in tension. They were pale gray today, like ash or smoke. The light from the small window touched the side of the frame but didn't reach the shuttle. He didn't begin weaving yet. He opened the door. The air was cold, but not biting. He stepped outside, letting his eyes scan the village edge. Nothing stirred. The boy and his dog didn't pass that morning. Bram wouldn't visit again until spring, most likely. The market was days away. Elric stood there for a while, not thinking about anything. Just standing. Then, as if pulled by something quiet and certain, he went back inside and reached for the whistle on the mantel. He hadn't played in years. Not since he was young. Not since the days when he sat on the floor while his father worked the loom and his mother spun songs into the shadows. He didn't know if the whistle would still sound. He sat by the hearth and held it to his lips. The first breath was soft, unsure. The sound that came was faint, thin and reedy, not beautiful. But it was true. He adjusted his grip, breathed again, and played a single note. Then another. Not a song, not really. Just sound. Long and slow, curling into the corners of the cottage like smoke. He played until the air grew warm again, until his fingers remembered how to move. Then he stopped. The silence returned, but it was fuller now. He set the whistle down and returned to the loom. The first pedal press felt heavier than usual. The wood creaked under his foot. The threads shivered. He picked up the shuttle, wound the thread tighter, and began the first pass. Clack. Pull. Return. It was a rhythm that had never left him. His hands moved on their own. The sound filled the cottage. Not loud, not fast, just steady. The same sound he had known as a child. The same one that had carried him through cold winters, empty cupboards, quiet rooms. He wove for hours. Not with urgency, not with purpose, but with presence. The cloth grew slowly, row by row. The grey thread caught the light and turned silver in places. A soft, humble cloth. Nothing meant for display. Just something to be used, maybe forgotten, but useful. At midday, he paused to eat. Bread and roots, warmed near the hearth. He ate slowly. There was no rush. Afterward, he walked to the chest and pulled out the folded brown wool, the one he had given the boy. The blanket was gone, of course. But he kept another just like it. He folded it again, more neatly this time, and placed it in a cloth bag. He walked it to the shed near the mill. The boy wasn't there, but someone, a neighbor, maybe, took it from him without question. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The walk home was short, and the path was dry. Birds had returned to the trees. The stream near the bend flowed clearer than it had in days. Back home, the shuttle waited, thread still taut. He worked until the light outside turned gold. When he stopped, he left the cloth on the loom. He didn't finish it. Not that day. Instead, he took the whistle once more and stood near the open window. He played again, 3 notes, simple and light. They drifted over the fields and into the quiet sky. Someone might hear them. Or no one would. It didn't matter. The sound was real. And the loom still spoke. The cloth had reached its end. The beam was full, the threads neat and tight, and Elric stood before the loom in silence, hands resting on the wooden frame. It had been a good weave, clean, steady, without knots. He could feel it in his joints, the kind of dull ache that told him the fabric would hold up well, maybe even be remembered. But the loom had begun to protest. Not loudly. Just a subtle shift in the lower treadle, a roughness in the tension bar, a groan that wasn't there the week before. Nothing alarming. Just old wood remembering its age. He sat beside it and ran his hand along the side rail, feeling where the edge had worn smooth. He tapped the treadle lightly with his foot. It shifted, not with resistance, but with uncertainty. A softness where firmness used to be. There was a time when he might have ignored it. But those days had passed. He knew the loom's voice too well. He fetched his tools from the chest under the shelf. A small hammer, a pair of pegs, a folded cloth, some tallow. Nothing fancy. All worn smooth with use, like everything in the cottage. He laid them out on the bench beside the loom and took a deep breath. The first thing to go was the treadle pin. It came loose with a little coaxing, revealing a worn groove where the wood had thinned. He replaced it with a thicker peg, tapping it in gently, testing the give. Then the tension bar. He lifted the beam and found the groove beneath, filling it with a layer of cloth before settling it back into place. Outside, the light shifted as the sun passed behind clouds. A soft wind picked up. He could hear the creak of distant trees. Inside, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that listened. He worked slowly, deliberately, not out of caution but out of care. Every piece had to be treated like a living thing. The loom was not a machine to him. It had weight, memory, shape, like a body. As he worked, he thought of the day it had arrived. He had been barely 17, still living with his father, still learning how thread pulled against tension, how cloth whispered its own direction. The loom had come in pieces, bundled and roped, hauled on a borrowed cart. They had built it together. His father had spoken little, but his hands had been steady. Now, all these years later, Elric's hands moved with the same steadiness. He applied tallow to the joints, checking for cracks. There were none deep enough to matter. He tightened the side rail, reinforced the rear brace. Each motion brought back a piece of time, a memory wrapped in sound, the clack of beam, the creak of seat, the rasp of thread pulling taut. By the time he finished, the sun had shifted lower in the sky. A golden light now filled the cottage, catching dust in the air. Elric stood and stretched his back, then stepped outside for a moment. The wind had grown colder. Smoke curled from a nearby chimney. Somewhere, a goat bleated. A woman laughed, faint and far off. He took a breath, then returned inside. The loom stood quietly in the corner. Waiting. Not fixed, perhaps, but comforted. Elric approached it, placed his hand on the top beam, and pressed lightly. The treadle responded without groan. The tension held. He didn't weave that evening. He simply sat beside it, a cup of warm broth in hand, and let the firelight mix with shadow. His body was tired in a different way, a slow, contented fatigue that settled behind the ribs and down the spine. He thought of how long he had worked. How much cloth had passed through his fingers. Most of it forgotten, no doubt, cut, sewn, stained, discarded. But that didn't matter. The cloth had served. That was its purpose. And the loom had given it. He looked at the whistle on the mantel. He didn't play it, but he imagined the sound. Then he closed his eyes. And rested. There was a loose thread on the floor. Elric noticed it just after dawn, when the light from the window caught something pale against the dark wood. He bent, picked it up, and held it between his fingers. Gray, thin, curled at the end. One of his, surely. But he didn't know from when. He sat by the hearth, thread in hand, and let it rest across his palm. It was not unusual. Threads escaped all the time. They slipped under benches, hid between floorboards, clung to the edges of tunics. But this one felt different. Not in texture. Not in length. Just in timing. He hadn't woven the day before. He'd spent it resting, thinking, sipping broth by firelight. So where had it come from? He placed it on the table, beside the whistle. The day moved slowly. The air was warmer than usual, touched by the start of spring. Thin birdsong returned to the edge of the fields. The trees, still mostly bare, whispered more softly than before. Elric swept the floor, folded the finished cloth, and hung it neatly from the ceiling beam. He set a kettle to boil. But he didn't go to the loom. Not yet. He walked instead. No destination. Just away from the door, down the path, past Marta's leaning fence and the hollow stump where mushrooms grew. His boots sank slightly into the soft earth, and his hands stayed in his pockets. The stream beside the mill had calmed after the storm. Water ran over rocks in small ribbons of silver. He stopped there, watching the light move. For a long time, he did nothing else. When he returned home, the kettle had boiled dry. He poured new water, added mint, and sipped it slowly. The thread was still on the table. It hadn't moved. He took it in his fingers again. Turned it. Rolled it between thumb and forefinger. Then, without deciding, he placed it in the center of the loom. Just laid it there. Not tied. Not woven. Just waiting. And then he stepped away. He sat by the window, a place he rarely sat today. The bench was narrow, the wood worn smooth. Outside, the clouds drifted in slow herds across the sky. He rested his head against the wall and closed his eyes. He thought about the first time he touched thread. Not cloth, not fabric. Just thread. He had been 5, maybe 6. His mother had let him wind it from one stick to another while she sang. The thread had broken, and he had cried, thinking he'd ruined everything. She had laughed and said, "No thread is wasted if you learn where it broke." He remembered the way she said it. Calm. Certain. He had never forgotten. The whistle sat untouched on the table, catching a line of sunlight that grew longer as the day moved. Shadows stretched across the floor, past the loom, toward the fire. He didn't work that day. He didn't leave. He didn't speak. He just sat, and let the thread wait. It began as a whisper. No clouds yet. No wind. Just the faintest shift in the air, like something stirring in its sleep. Elric noticed it when he stepped outside with his tea, steam rising gently, the cup warm between his hands. He paused near the door and looked at the sky. Still pale. Still blue. But it felt suspended. Like a held breath. The earth beneath his boots was dry again, the mud long packed down into hard curves. The leaves near the creek had begun to show green at the edges. Birds flitted through the branches without fear. Still, something in him knew. He finished his tea and set the cup on the stone beside the steps. He didn't return inside immediately. He walked the edge of the fence, checking the posts with idle hands. A few leaned. One had split down the grain. He made a note in his mind to patch it, though he knew he wouldn't today. He ended his circuit beneath the tall alder tree, the one with the low branch that nearly brushed his shoulder. He ran his fingers across the bark, then sat on the bench he had built years ago from scrap beams. The bench creaked beneath him. It always did. He let it. From there, he could see the shape of the land. The gentle dip in the road before Marta's home. The darker lines where water still moved under moss. And the cottage. His own. Slightly crooked, but solid. Smoke trailing faintly from the chimney. One shutter permanently ajar. He sat and watched. And after a while, the wind came. It was not loud. Not violent. Just enough to change the direction of the smoke. To lift a strand of hair from his brow. To make the alder leaves rustle once. Then, the clouds. They gathered without warning, low and heavy, as if they had always been there but only now decided to be seen. The color of ash. Or wool dipped in cold iron. Elric rose and returned to the cottage. Inside, the light shifted as the clouds deepened. The hearth remained unlit. The whistle still sat on the table. The thread still lay across the loom. Unwoven. He did not touch it. Instead, he fetched the oil lamp and trimmed the wick. Lit it. Set it on the windowsill. The flame danced once, then held steady. He boiled more water. Broth this time. Thicker, with roots and barley. He didn't sit to eat it. He stood near the door, bowl in hand, and watched as the first drops touched the earth. Soft. Wide apart. Not yet a storm. But rain, all the same. He left the door open. The air filled with that smell, damp bark, soaked dirt, old leaves waking. He drank his broth slowly, letting each sound from outside fill the space between his breaths. When the bowl was empty, he set it aside. Not washed. Just placed carefully near the basin. He moved to the loom and sat, not to weave, but simply to sit. One hand rested near the shuttle. The other draped across his knee. The thread still waited. He didn't tie it. He didn't move it. He just watched the rain as it grew steady. There was comfort in not beginning. In leaving the cloth unfinished. In the patience of it. The fire would wait until later. The tools were already clean. The roof didn't leak. And the lamp burned evenly. Everything else could be still. The sound of the rain became a rhythm. Not unlike thread pulling tight. Not unlike the sigh of a finished line. He thought, then, about how little he needed now. Not out of sorrow. But out of clarity. The world was narrower than it once had been. But deeper, too. He stood once more, only to close the door. The wind had cooled. And the house was ready. There was an old letter on the shelf. Elric had passed it dozens of times, maybe hundreds. It rested between a coil of twine and a folded length of cloth no longer useful. Too coarse to sell, too narrow to mend with. The paper had yellowed. The edges curled slightly from years of stove heat and winter damp. He didn't reach for it at first. He simply looked at it, the way you look at something familiar only when silence makes it unfamiliar again. Outside, the rain from the day before had softened to mist. The cottage window was streaked, blurring the trees beyond. Inside, it was warm. The hearth crackled with quiet confidence. A pot of herbs simmered slowly on the flat stone. Elric sipped water, not tea. The taste of mint lingered from the last boil, ghost-like. He sat, facing the shelf. The letter had been there for more than a year. He knew what it said. Or rather, he knew the shape of what it said. He hadn't opened it. Hadn't needed to. The seal had long worn off. No name on the front anymore. But he remembered who it was from. A cousin from the coast. One he hadn't seen since he was young, since the festival where they'd eaten salted fish and tried to walk fence rails after cider. She had written only once. The handwriting was careful, though he hadn't dared read it yet. It had arrived with Bram. He had accepted it with a nod and placed it on the shelf. And left it there. For a month. Then a season. Then another. Until it became part of the wall, just another quiet thing that didn't ask anything of him. But today, it asked. He stood slowly and approached it. His joints cracked in the quiet. He took it from the shelf and held it, feeling how the paper gave slightly under his fingers. Soft now, almost like cloth. He sat near the fire and opened it. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were intact. She spoke of wind on the docks, of a boy born to her sister, of a new roof they built from scrap planks and prayers. She mentioned an old song he used to hum, how it still found her when storms passed. There was no urgency. Just memory. Just her voice, somehow still warm after so many seasons. At the bottom, she had written only this: "If you ever think of salt, write me." He folded the letter and held it in his lap. He didn't move for a long time. Eventually, he stood and placed it, not back on the shelf, but in the wooden box near the hearth. The one where he kept thread ends too short to use, pebbles shaped like eggs, bits of string that had once tied parcels. A box for things that mattered without needing purpose. The rain picked up again, just a little. He lit the oil lamp earlier than usual, even though it wasn't quite dark. The light pushed softly against the window's blur. He moved the folded cloth beside the shelf to the rag pile, coiled the twine and hung it on its peg. The shelf looked smaller without the letter. He didn't mind. He went to the loom, touched the waiting thread, then walked past it. He picked up the whistle and sat by the fire. He played 3 notes. Then 4. Not a song. Just a memory. The days grew longer. Not suddenly. Not all at once. Just enough that Elric began to notice the shift in shadows. The lamp stayed unlit a little later each evening. The fire didn't need feeding before nightfall. A breeze came more often through the cracked shutter, not cold anymore, just present. He didn't mark the days. Never had. But he knew the shape of them. The way time thinned or thickened depending on the weight it carried. Lately, the days had felt lighter. Not because less happened, but because less was needed. The cloth on the beam remained unfinished. He checked it sometimes. Smoothed it with his palm. The thread still waited across the frame, untouched. Not because he'd forgotten, but because he hadn't yet arrived at the moment to begin again. And maybe that moment would never come. He was no longer in a hurry to find out. Most mornings began the same. Tea or broth. A walk around the cottage. A quiet thought passed over the fence. Birds followed him more now. A pair of doves had taken to resting near the eaves. He didn't feed them, but he nodded to them as he passed. One morning, he found a feather on the windowsill. Not large. Pale gray with a thin stripe near the base. He held it between his fingers, then tucked it behind the whistle on the mantel. No reason. It just belonged there. The whistle had become part of his rhythm again. Some days, he played it softly before sunrise, while the fire still caught its breath. Other times, not at all. The notes didn't mean anything in particular. But the sound reminded him that breath itself was enough. That nothing had to be built to be valuable. That not all cloth needed weaving. He had dreams now and then, ones where he was young again, walking through fields, the grass higher than his waist. Sometimes the dreams were quiet. Sometimes full of voices. He never remembered them clearly. But he always woke with a sense of arrival. As if someone had just whispered something worth holding on to. The letter remained in the wooden box. He hadn't read it again. Didn't need to. He remembered the words. Especially the last one. Salt. That word stayed with him more than he expected. It appeared in soup, in the air when wind came from the south, in the dried streaks on his boots after a walk through thawed soil. It meant more than it should. Or maybe it always had. He still visited the stream. The water ran brighter now. Clearer. He didn't sit long anymore. But each time he passed, he touched one of the flat stones with his hand. Not for luck. Not for memory. Just for contact. The loom stood patiently in its corner. He didn't move it. Didn't clean it beyond what was needed. It had done enough. So had he. One evening, as the sky turned gold over the fields, Elric lit the oil lamp and opened the window wider than usual. The wind came in, soft and full of faraway things. Smoke from the chimney curled upward, then vanished. He played 1 note. Then 2. Then none. And Saturday. He looked at the shadows on the floor. They didn't move. And that was fine. In the corner, the thread still waited.